We're live now. Thank you, Rick.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Waterloo Mayor Dave Jaworski welcoming you to the City of Waterloo Council meeting, Monday, April 4th, 2022 at 2 p.m. We'll start the meeting with our favorite thing, a roll call, beginning with Ward 1.
Good afternoon. Councillor Hanmer, present.
Councillor Bodley, present.
Councillor Veith, present.
Councillor Vasic, present.
Councillor Henry, present.
Councillor Bonagor, present.
And the mayor's here too. I'd just like to hear from Ward 4, please. Councillor Freeman, I didn't hear you, but we know you're there.
Councillor Freeman, can you hear me now?
Absolutely. Wonderful.
I accidentally pressed a mute button on the headset. My apologies.
No worries. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather and are broadcasting from today is the land traditionally cared for by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We also acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today. And as we look through the upcoming agenda today, we see we're going to be looking at an affordable housing strategy and how we can make the land that's available to all of us more accessible to all. At the beginning of this council meeting, we pause to think about the needs of our community. May we show wisdom and compassion in all our decisions. I'll now look to council for disclosure of pecuniary interest and the general nature thereof, if any. Hearing none, I'll look forward to item 8, which is the approval of minutes. And we have the March 7th, 2022 council meeting. Does anybody have any commentary on that? And if not, I'll be looking for somebody to put their hand. Councillor Veith is moving it. Councillor Bodley is seconding it. And we'll do the voting. Begin with Ward 1, please.
Councillor Hanmer in favor.
Councillor Bodley in favor.
Sorry, Councillor Veith in favor.
Councillor Freeman in favor.
Councillor Vasic in favor.
Councillor Henry in favor.
Councillor Bonagor in favor.
And the mayor's in favor too. That carries unanimously. I can almost hear the smiles on your face. I'm not sure it's because you're approving minutes, because the sun is out, or because the first item up is the Communitech annual update by Chris Albinson, President and CEO of Communitech. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris. I believe Chris has a slide deck that we'll be able to pull up.
Thank you, Mayor. Hopefully you can hear me okay, Mayor.
Absolutely, Chris.
So first of all, I wanted to thank the mayor and a number of the councilors that reached out with a warm welcome to the community. I've almost been here a year and really excited to tell you we feel a little bit like a dog who caught a car, but hopefully that'll be clear as we go through the updates. I'm going to do this hopefully pretty quickly in the next 10 minutes and then open it back to the mayor and council for questions. I'm not sure who's moving the slides along, so forgive me if I just ask for next slide, if that's okay. Great, thank you. I think most of you are familiar with Communitech, but just to let you know, we're really pleased again that Deloitte recognized us as one of the greatest innovation ecosystems in the country from a dollar in and a dollar out. So really thrilled to have that recognition. And I was actually in a conversation in Chicago last week with organizations from Austin, from Chicago, also Seattle, right across the United States. And I think we're really privileged to have such an amazing ecosystem that we built here. Always nice to hear that outside in. With over 1,200 members, 1,000 founders across the region and 200 partners. And employing 1 million people. So that's the Dr. Evil pinky finger. Next slide. The real exciting thing to report back to council is despite the pandemic, and there's been a lot of tough news that you've had to deal with, the one thing that I would be able to say to you is that we've had a lot of success on our side. So our local founders raised $1.28 billion last year. That's about 165% increase year on year. Was the biggest year that we've ever had as an organization, now 25 years in. So really excited about the success our founders have had. A little over 1,200 members, as I talked about, 147 tenant companies that are working out of our space. That's growing pretty dramatically in an interesting shift because of hybrid. So more and more companies using our space as sort of a campsite where, if their teams are remote, they have a place to come together. 17 corporate members across the ecosystem, including folks like Manulife and others locally. And then a lot of virtual events, as I'm sure you all experienced. Next slide. One of the things that we're really proud about is our Fierce Founders program that has continued to go from strength to strength. And we're now a little over 240 women-led or identifying or non-binary founders that have graduated, and another cohort of 30 that are in process. So really excited about the continued progress there. And again, I want to thank council for their support of that important program. Next slide. So the City of Waterloo has always been a core partner for us, really since 2009. So I wanted to just give you a quick update on the results. I think one of the big things that we're most excited by, but I think relates a little bit to the housing conversation that council is going to be having later on, is we're way ahead of target. So when I started 12 months ago, the hope was that we would get to 24,000 tech workers in the region by 2025. We passed 26,000 last year. So that's an increase over 47%, which has caused us to basically have to redo all of our modeling. And we're now projecting 55,000 tech workers, so another more than doubling again by 2030. And so hopefully you can connect the dots on some of the things that I talked about, but one of the interesting things, if you look at the amount of capital that was raised in the last 12 months, that's all forward-looking. So that money is going to be invested in building new technology and building the teams up, and that's why we're very confident around the midpoint of our range of 55,000 tech workers in the region by 2030. And we're now the 14th best place in the world. If you're a tech startup, we're working, I think this is still one of the most underreported stories in terms of how awesome it is to build and live in the region. And I think you're going to see us do more crazy things like the billboard we bought in Times Square last year when it was ridiculously cheap because no one was in Times Square because of COVID. That ended up getting 45 million media impressions. And just talking about, and actually just a fun one for you, we just found out that the US Congress actually had hearings on how our community was trying to recruit international talent out of the United States. So we're definitely punching above our weight, which is fun to see. Since 2010, we've been privileged to support almost 4,000 new startups, $4.5 billion in capital raised, $4 billion plus in acquisitions, and 24,000 in new jobs created. Next slide. So this is a sad one for me, a beloved building that we were fortunate to have council's support on. The data hub was, the owner had made a decision to sell that facility, and that sale is sort of in process to close in the next couple of weeks. I just wanted to kind of recognize the support of council to make that facility and bring it together. It was a really important part of our execution from a program point of view. Just to give you one story, because there are many, but the Open Data Exchange was housed program-wise there. That was really the first place that Martin Bashir and his two brothers, when they were starting Applyboard, had an opportunity to get supported by us and put the architecture together that now is Applyboard. For those that haven't seen the story, it's amazing in many, many ways, but they now employ, in less than 6 years, now employing over 1,500 people from 40 different countries, speaking 60 different languages, all here in the region, and the birthplace of it was right there at the Data Hub. So I think we wanted to highlight that success and know that it's an important part of how we're trying to think about going forward, finding some alternative space near Uptown Waterloo to continue program. And again, want to thank council for their support for the 5 years of awesome work in that facility. Next slide. So what comes next? We've launched what we call the True North strategy, and it really was based on talking to 1,100 founders and really trying to understand what are the critical issues in terms of getting in the way of success for them. Next slide. On the positive side, and I'll pull the lens out a little bit from locally, Canadian startups raised $17.2 billion last year. And locally in the region, the companies that we work with raised $3.2 billion in 14 months. That's equal to what was raised in the previous 14 years combined. So we are really on an exponential growth curve. And so just hats off to all of the founders that have worked so hard, during a really difficult time and have just, had great success. Next slide. So we've leaned in really directly on this idea of own the podium, not the bumper sticker version of it, but actually the hard work that Kathy Priestner did. And for those not familiar with it, she was the architect of Own the Podium. Privileged to have her as a partner working with us in the region doing this. And the simple, and in the time I won't do her work credit, but the simple idea for those of us that have enough gray hair, as I do, you'll remember something called participation. And Kathy said, although participation was a great thing that Canada did, you're not going to be the best in the world by doing participation. And we needed to use objective data to find the athletes that had the probability of success, and then look at the things that were getting in their way of success and investing in those things. And then We had the great celebration in Vancouver, where we went from fourth quartile in the world to top decile in the world in terms of gold medals, top of podium, and the continued success we experienced both in the recent winter and summer games. Next slide. So we're basically using that same methodology to identify really high-performing companies across the country, and our goal is to get to 14 companies doing more than $1 billion in revenue. Our view is if we're able to achieve that, there's enough big trees in the ecosystem that we never again experience what happened when BlackBerry and Nortel went down, and we had a decade of where the big anchor went away and a lot of dislocation. And so the objective is to have a density of high-performing companies. This sounded like a very crazy idea. I'll say out loud when I put it out there as the new goal for Communitech, in terms of the aspiration by 2030. Pleased to report back to council, we have one company that's already crossed $1 billion in revenue last year. Next slide. So I'm not going to go, given time, I'll stop there, but just know that we're continuing to work with early stage companies. That's really the bread and butter of what we're doing every day. But we now have a critical mass of what we call at-scale companies, and we're adding programming there. We were really thrilled and honored to have the impact in starting the Digital Main Street program that impacted over 6,000 small and medium-sized enterprise across southwestern Ontario, and our contribution, I guess, to helping us all get through the pandemic. So working with everyone from small restaurant owners to bike shops. It was a really great partnership with the University of Waterloo, and really thrilled that we're continuing that partnership with the university and the hospitals. And so Vivek Goel, the new president of University of Waterloo, myself, and the presidents of our hospitals all talk every Thursday morning, every week, just to keep coordinated and working hand in glove. And I'll leave these other items for your reference. And I think I've hit just around my 10 minutes, so I'll stop there. Mayor, thank you very much for the time, and go to questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you for relocating back here on a morning or days like today. When we look at the weather forecast, we kind of think that we're very thankful to have you back. And I would say I do appreciate seeing you when I'm on my way to work, seeing you working the phone either in front of the data hub or sometimes at King and Herb, or I've seen you walking down the street for the Uptown Square working the phone. So it's very good of you, and I know how much you've really jumped in with both feet. I do have a question coming up already. Councillor Hammer, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor, through you to Chris. Chris, thank you again for coming. I must say, every time I hear your presentation, I am more and more amazed of what we've been able to do, and through your leadership and also those before you with Communitech, certainly has been a good direction for our community, and near and dear to my heart, the work with the hospitals as well. So I'm pleased to see where the progress is going. I was intrigued with your comment about and recognizing that we've got affordable housing that we're going to be talking about later today. From your perspective, as we increase with the number of tech talent in the community, what is the type of housing that we need to be focused on thinking about from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a question that I'm not as detailed as I should be on it, but one that I'm very concerned about. And the reason for that, and probably not lost on council, is the cost of a home in the region has gone up very dramatically. And I lived through the tech explosion in San Francisco, and there were some really good things about that from an economic point of view. But also when you see families living in cars because they can't afford housing, I think the challenge is most municipal governments. And this is not a criticism, just a reality, are set up for linear, right? So the province says what their growth model is, you get those targets, and then you're trying to figure out, okay, how do we, hit the targets from a housing point of view? We're going through exponential growth from a tech sector point of view, and every tech sector job. So if we're going to add another 25 to 26,000 tech jobs. That's going to add 3 people per direct. So you're looking at 75,000 new residents. And then the associated services associated with those jobs to kind of keep quality of life. So I do worry a lot about the strain that it's going to put on the ecosystem. I think generally council's doing the right thing, which is, building up around, transit and building vertically. I think makes a ton of sense. I did invite Mayor, and if there are other councilors that are interested, our Consul General in San Francisco is going to help us put together a little bit of a learning session in San Francisco at the end of June, and talking to councilors, the mayor there, as well as the tech sector around, if we are going through an exponential curve, are there things that we can learn from their experience and hopefully not repeat the mistakes. But appreciate the thoughtful question.
Yeah, thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hanmer. Over to you, Councillor Henry.
Thanks, Mayor. And Councillor Hanmer asked one of my 2 questions. I'd appreciate your comments, Chris, and that there are some opportunities to do some learnings. I'd sort of suggest into that it's not just governments that are sort of set up to be incremental and linear in this way, but the building and construction sector. Labor doesn't scale exponentially either. Supply chains and materials aren't scaling exponentially, and we know that we've got 36, I think, thousand permitted units that aren't being built right now around the region. So I think there's lots of problems in the land of exponentials that a world that's linear isn't set up well to deal with. So any learnings I think would be helpful to keep those in mind. The question I still have for you, and I think it's I think Communitech is well positioned to sort of work on this if this is something that needs work. You commented about the goal around getting 14 companies to $1 billion in annual revenue sales, and that the approach similar to Own the Podium was one where you sort of use data and sort of objective performance to be able to channel resources and support to help people get there. But one of the things we know is that data and the algorithms around it are sort of couched through the eyes of the humans who sort of see it and use it. I think of the tech for good, thoughts that we try to have around algorithms and disruption. So I'm wondering what thought you're giving to the impacts of sort of the use of objective data and sort of high performance seen through the lens of sort of equity, diversity, and inclusion, which we're clearly applying at the startup level, at the founders level up front. But I wonder how that sort of follows along the way, so that we don't end up focusing resources on sort of performers that have different legs up, and we're not making sure that we've got sort of an equitable lens at the algorithm that we're applying to get to 14.
Yeah, no, really thoughtful question. So a couple things. One, the way we are using the performance algorithm, it's basically based on 20 years of data globally on Silicon Valley Bank data. And so it's meant to say, okay, from around the world, if you said, what does outperformance look like, or companies that have the probability of global success, what do those companies look like? And applying that to the 17,000 venture startups. So in that sense, it's sort of an objective lens. That being said, Communitech obviously has got a very core focus on tech for good. And frankly, we actually see that as an economic opportunity, not only for the region, but for the country. When big tech is not trusted out of China, not trusted out of the United States, that trust can be Canada's brand and our brand locally, and doubling down on that. And so we really see that as core to it. We've been fortunate not to have to have too many members asked to not be members of the organization, but if they don't live up to tech for good, which includes equity, diversity, and inclusion, as well as sort of the mission, they've been asked not to be members. And so we basically try to apply that objective quantitative measure to a set of really amazing founders that cover off the core mission, and that's how we're knitting those things together. And I think, it allows us to talk about, great stories like Carol Lehman's at Exonify or Martin Bashiri's at Apply Board, talk about global success and high performance while we're also celebrating tech for good and equity, diversity, and inclusion. Because from our perspective, we're going to beat Silicon Valley not by being Silicon Valley. We have to do it in a very Canadian way, in a very different way, and I appreciate the question.
No, thanks, Chris, and I appreciate that. It's not just well, here's 20 years of data out of the valley, but there's our spin and our sense of what that needs to mean to do it right, to do it in a way that we can all be proud of. So I appreciate your grappling with this question and are working on probably dynamic systems that will be in place and be thought of as these roll out over time. Thanks, Chris.
Yep.
And I'll just pause for a moment while I look for any last minute hands up. And I'm not seeing any at this time, Chris, but you're very accessible. We know where to find you. That's on the streets of Waterloo. Certainly from a trust perspective, you've earned the trust, I can speak personally, of me. And I would say if anybody in this community couldn't be happier, I'm sure it's Ian Klugman himself, and having passed on successfully to you, and with all the pivoting and changes that has to go on with Communitech, as it does with every other organization, I think you've got a lot of exciting things forthcoming for Communitech and for the community, Chris. So any final words on how Council can help Communitech, maybe with True North or something like that? Anything come to mind?
Well, first of all, Mayor, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you for your leadership, and I'm sorry to hear you're not running again. And I can pass that on to a couple of council members too, who've been just very generous with your time and really welcoming me. And I just can't say enough about how impactful that was, allowing me to get up to speed. And fortunately, I've been able to keep Ian in the building, so we just had lunch together. So I've got good counsel on that front too. I would say, to answer your question, I was struck last week sitting in Chicago looking at my peers that are leading organizations in Austin, Texas, in New York, in Atlanta, in Seattle, at how envious they were of the amazing community we've got here and how well it works together to really punch way above our weight. And our former Governor General was kind enough to chat with me before I stepped in, and David, as I'm sure all familiar to all of you, said, hey, if you're going to build a big barn, and True North is a very big barn, to be clear, we want this area to be the #1 innovation hub on the planet. And I think we've got a shot, probably for the first time in 25 years. You have to bring everyone together to do it. And so one of our biggest challenges is we're under-marketed right now as people are thinking about leaving Silicon Valley for lots of reasons you've probably read about. They talk about Austin. They talk about going to Florida. They talk about going to New York. They don't talk about coming to our region. And so we've got a bit of a marketing problem, that we got to market a little bit more aggressively and a little bit more globally. I'm not bringing that to council with a specific ask or a specific plan, but no, the kind of guerrilla marketing we did with the Times Square billboard, I think, is one of the challenges that we've got. And the reason for that, and probably not lost on all of you, is the #1 issue for our founders in terms of growing and staying here is talent. And so we really need to reach way beyond the borders of Ontario and Canada to bring talent into the region if the companies that we've worked so hard over the last 10 years to nurture stay and grow here. And so that's the one thing I would leave you with. And for any counselors that are interested to talk more about that, happy to dive into it. We've got an amazing opportunity, just truly amazing. And again, I feel a little bit like we're the dog that caught the car, but we're going to have to work to hold on to it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you for the kind words to those of us on council, and I wish you all the best. Look forward to seeing you in person at an event someday soon. We'll see you.
Likewise, and I think, Mayor, you know that we're putting that trip together at the end of June to San Francisco to do that learn. So if there's those from council that are interested to participate, please reach out to me.
Excellent. I will forward them on the information that you sent me. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Mayor.
And with that, we move on to item 10, which is a workshop, a fire master plan workshop, and Deputy Chief Sandy Van Solm will be introducing this to us. Please go ahead, Sandy, when you can.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just to introduce myself, my name is Sandy Van Solm. I'm the Deputy Fire Chief. I'm here with DC Herring, the second Deputy Fire Chief, and we're here on behalf of Chief Haptich. And a pleasure to make the introductions to POMAX. Late 2021, Waterloo Fire Rescue issued an RFP for the development of a fire master plan, and this includes a community risk assessment as mandated by the Office of the Fire Marshal. The Fire Master Plan will provide a 10-year roadmap for the Waterloo Fire Services and for Council to determine overall community safety levels and services provided by Waterloo Fire. This includes public education, prevention, and suppression. The RFP, as mentioned, has been rewarded to POMAX, and we have invited POMAX today to conduct a workshop with Council to assist with the development of the Fire Master Plan. They have prepared 3 questions that have been sent to you ahead of time, and we're hoping for your input on these questions. And with this, I will turn it to John Hambides from POMAX. John, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, the WebEx has gone out on me. I can hear, but I can't mute, unmute, or see screens or anything like that. So I'm just getting a scroll that says starting WebEx. Anyway, thank you very much for having us here and taking the time to be with us. Under normal circumstances, sorry, the other thing that I'll have to say is you'll just have to interrupt me if you have questions because, as I say, I can't see anything. Under normal circumstances in a fire master plan, we'd be at the point where we would be able to give you a presentation and tell you what we found so far. However, this one is in a very tight timeline. With the date that we managed to get the data, which was very quick actually coming from the fire service, and the work we've been able to do in the last couple of weeks, we're not ready to present that. So that's the reason we've decided that we would try to elicit some information from you and have prepared the 3 questions. So I wonder if anybody would like to either start with answering one of the questions, or if you have your own questions,
John?
Yes.
John, sorry, it's the city clerk. I believe, Sarah, you were going to monitor the chat. Are you still able to do that? See the screen for John, just to make this go as smooth as possible?
Yes, absolutely. That's not a problem.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks very much. So if anyone would like to offer a comment or start addressing any of the questions, we'd appreciate it.
Well, while we wait for ones, oh, there's one right there. I won't have to go first. Councillor Henry, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mayor, and thank you, John and team. I think just starting from a comment perspective, this is obviously a very important process and plan, and so I appreciate that you've told us up front that if we have specific questions around current performance and data, those things will be packaged for us later, because this is sort of a very sort of quick exercise, and that's not what's before us today. And my other high-level comment from a finance chair hat perspective is, protective services and all of the important work that they do is certainly a very significant budget line for the city, and there are impacts that come from this, and so that's always top of mind for me as we balance the risks. We also have to continue to balance the budget and to sort of understand how we can plan well with all the different things that cities must cope with and balance. So trying to take the questions in in turn as they're there, and you're asking about IT. My sense is is that we don't have a lot of line of sight into the individual operational IT needs and costs, but I would highlight a couple of things that I'm curious about and interested in as you work through this. One is I know that we've used automatic ringers into the fire station, and the rest is a sort of behind the scenes IT piece to help speed up response, which is assisting us in some corners of the city. So if there are things that let us shorten time windows, that's something that I sort of appreciate appreciate learning and knowing more about. That those investments can pay great dividends in terms of seconds when we have suppression response needs. And the other one is as we target our prevention work. This year, Council's budget included hiring a new fire prevention officer, recognizing that we've had a gap and a growing backlog of needs in the prevention side, upstreaming some of those resources. And we're told that that extra resource will help us work down that backlog. I'm curious through this process if there's sort of evolution in whether that's sort of AI thinking or different algorithmic responses to help us target and manage that fire prevention work so that it is as effective, as time effective and resource effective as possible, and going after those high risks, assessing those, and being able to be dynamic about that, so that when we're doing that upstream work on sort of prevention education initiatives, that we are targeting that as well as possible. If we're not going to go question by question, maybe I'll just leave it there on question one, and then let other folks come in, and then I can jump in on a couple of others.
Sure, that sounds good, Councillor Henry. I will turn it over now to Councillor Veith.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks for this. I don't know. Like Councillor Henry said, we're not, as councillors in on the everyday workings of, how things happen at the fire hall or all that stuff. So, but as far as technology, fire information technology, is that, I guess, is that different than IT for the city of Waterloo? Like I don't know, right? I just, and is this, whatever that technology is it shared across other fire departments? Or has the City of Waterloo Fire Department got, technology that nobody else has, or are they thinking about developing it, or is there somewhere out there some benchmark or some kind of fire tech IT that is already there? So anyway, those are kind of my thoughts. And yeah, is IT unique to fire, or is it? And are we pooling? Would we be pooling with other jurisdictions? And in the end, and people just want the fire to be put out, right? So however that has to happen, I think is the basis of all of this. So anyway, that's a little bit not too clear probably, but anyway, that's kind of where I'm at with this. So thanks.
Oh, very good commentary, Councillor Veith. I'll go to Sandy, Deputy Chief. When we say technology here, could you give us an example of what we're thinking of, or perhaps I'll let you go to the consultant. I'll let you redirect as required.
Yeah, I'll redirect that question to John, if you don't mind, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. So you've touched on two things that are very important to us as a company. First of all, this sounds a little pie in the sky to some people, but it isn't. We appreciate the idea of a fire happening and putting the fire out and doing it as quickly as possible. There's a couple of things in there. One is the response, but the other thing is what happens on the fire scene. So there's data which is one part of it, and there's metrics, which is the individual pieces of data that fire services throughout North America rarely look at. Let me give you a really obvious example. The National Fire Protection Association talks about certain response times. Some of the other things that need to be talked about, though, is how long does it take to hook up a fire hose? Because it could be 5 or 7 minutes after the fire truck arrives before a fire hose is hooked up and there's water or some form of agent on a fire. So those metrics aren't available in a relational database that can be drawn out quickly and inform things like public education or perhaps training needs. Perhaps training can get that hookup and water on the fire down by 2 minutes or a minute. You accomplish a lot by that. That's a lot of time saved. It's not just the response time. So one of of course, the other thing that we encourage is public education and prevention. If the fire doesn't start in the first place, it's safer for everybody. It's safer for the public. It's safer for the firefighters because obviously they're not risking themselves fighting a fire. So the two parts of this fire master plan, not to exclude the whole idea of response, because those are going to continue happening in all sorts of facets, fire, rescue, and so on, is public education and prevention, and also the data and the metrics, which aren't available very easily in North America, but they are available in other jurisdictions, other countries. From a technology point of view, those are the sort of things that we'll be looking at. And, you know, we already have some recommendations around that. What's important is for us to be able to explain why those are very important and why those are also life-saving measures, because often the idea of an IT person or somebody who can actually do data and metrics and fathom out what they mean is a difficult sell from a cost point of view. But if it can be related to the safety of the community, then sometimes it's very good value. I'll stop because I can't see somebody holding their hands up or saying, please stop talking.
Yeah, no, that's good, John. And so what I would say, I will give my input now that on item number 1, that technology should be assessed from a ROI perspective, return on investment, which could be on, cost savings. It could be on public education where a 2x investment might enable us to reach 10x more people. And then finally on, on time and that and saving time. Now on the latter on data gathering, I would say if there's even a more efficient way to look at it, that is use a proxy where the data from another jurisdiction also applies to our jurisdiction and we can get on with it, I would say those would be the kind of answers I would look for, or the insight I would look for in the fire master plan from my perspective with respect to technology. And with that, I have a number of councillors lined up here talking about Q1, so I'll go to Councillor Freeman next.
Thank you, through you, Mayor Jaworski. Just confirming that everyone can hear me.
Sounding good.
Thank you. So when I look at question 1, in addition to what the mayor said, I agree with the comment about the return on investment. I think one of the things that immediately came to mind for me on this question is the integration with other emergency services. So I know that in this past term of council, and a significant investment was made with regard to communications and how those communications interacted with other first responders. So for me, when I look at technology, I would also be looking to that interconnectivity between other first responders, and also not in terms of when I think of return on investment, I would also like to think that if technology is going to be invested in, that the data collected will actually inform future decision making as it relates to fire services. So if I put it in the context of what I understand the police have done, and I'm not on the police board, and this is just my understanding from having listened to the chief and read articles on it was that, they used data associated with calls to determine how they were going to deploy and or redeploy police services. So my understanding is that they were getting the majority of their calls, for example, between say 9 o'clock at night and 2 o'clock in the morning. So they looked at how do we allocate resources based on the data that's been collected as it relates directly to the calls for service. And so I don't know whether there's an equivalent of that on the fire side, but that's the kind of things that would come to mind as it relates to technology. And then obviously if that data is very useful in terms of, informing resourcing, equipment purchases, budget pressures, then you'd have to balance the cost of that data against the value of the information garnered. So I'm not sure if that's helpful, but that was certainly kind of what came to mind for me. And we also, I don't think, can be in a place where we're going to have a lowered fire insurance safety rating, so a lowered FUS rating, because we've failed to invest in technology. So again, there has to be that balance between benefit and cost.
Yeah, thank you. And we'll just keep cycling through the councillors on this one. Councillor Bonagor on Q1.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor Jaworski. I think we all may end up sounding a little similar. For me, this was a very broad question, so I'm going to offer a very broad answer, and that is it depends on the tech and it depends on the cost. If we end up, if more efficient technology means that we need fewer stations, fewer vehicles, smaller vehicles, or different equipment, if it means that we can meet the community needs while lowering our climate impact, that is definitely of interest. But it all depends on what we're getting for the investment. Thanks, Mayor.
Fair enough. A good way to say ROI, except in real words. Thank you very much, Councillor Bonagor. Councillor Hanmer, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you, John. I love these kind of questions, and I'll look at it. I agree with my colleagues so far on the return on investment piece, but I would add a quality component to it as well. So what's the quality of the service that we're providing or able to provide, because we've got real-time data that can be used in a meaningful way to I like that you're putting things in the safety lens, education, communication, etc. I would just add a quality lens to that as well. And I think the technology and the use of it efficiently and effectively is going to make a real difference. Again, though, the cost benefit of it is going to be important for us too as we look forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just do last call for anyone who wants to weigh in on Q1 before we move to Q2. And while I wait for that, John, do you have any questions of clarification on what you've heard so
far? Thank you. Yes, we really need to comment that we look at emergency services, whether it be police, fire, EMS, but in this case it's a fire service, as a business unit, and it needs to be approached as a business unit, keeping in mind that it's got the very important task of protecting life. But otherwise, just commenting on your ROI perspective, we agree with that fully. It has to show a return.
Yeah, and I think I might emphasize or take the baton that Councillor Bonagor has passed along, that the Fire Master Plan will certainly have items or priorities that are within the insular world that it's supposed to be in, the Fire Master Plan. However, a future council will have to compare investments along the lines of other things in terms of climate change and that. So it should be at least at least cognizant of those other competing priorities that future councils will see as demands are and ever-mounting pressures are on municipal councils. I will move on to the next one. John, can you just introduce the question 2?
Sure. Sorry, I'm moving between computers here. So we're wondering what roles the fire service should address in the municipality. We talked about prevention, inspection, public education, fire response. There's medical response. There is a thought that there's a social element within fire services, and when there's time available to fire services, perhaps they can fulfill some sort of social service, and working with social services for the protection of people who may be at risk and so on, all, with a lens on fire prevention and fire service, but we just wanted to know council's perspective of that.
Excellent. We have a couple lined up already. Councillor Henry, please go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I think we obviously have some legislative responsibilities and some community expectations that, in fact, we're responding to all of these. I would instead think of it more as a hierarchy of services, and then what people do when they're not responding to suppression work, since that's where we load down on resources, but we're not always sending folks out. The further up the chain you get into prevention, the more valuable it is. I think that's an important area for us to address. And when we're not out doing suppression work, I think there's been value. I know the chief has had this perspective that there's been value in having our suppression staff so do that work in public education and in prevention activities as it sort of helps stretch our resources and time efficiency in a better way. I'm cautious around, it'll be interesting to see how the medical response aspect of this role changes over time. And I know one of the concerns that our chief has had that becomes foremost in my mind is not having any kind of response expectation where we get, bogged down in offload delays in hospitals and the rest, that we serve our role because we might happen to be there first. But let others take their role on and not get bogged down and then impact our ability to respond to other things from a suppression point of view.
No, sorry, I wasn't sure if there's still more coming. That's the end, Councillor Henry?
Yeah, that's good enough for now. I've got a lot more on question.
Okay. Moving on to Councillor Hammer. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Councillor Henry, I would be quite intrigued to see a fire truck in our ambulance bay waiting for an offload. I don't know that our bays are quite big enough to hold the truck, but that would be interesting in itself. I think with the services, John, when I think of this, I would agree with Councillor Henry that the education and prevention aspect of what fire services are able to do are really important. The suppression obviously has to be the first piece, but when we've got that opportunity, when I think about this particular question, though, I also think in terms of the other services, we're not doing this in isolation. We're part of a larger service. And so we've got to keep that in mind. And I'd like to see in a 10-year plan, if there are opportunities for improvements in how fire, police, and paramedics are working together as first responders, and what are the things that we may need to work toward, recognizing that fire is separate for each and the other two are regionalized. But I think if we don't start looking at that, we too will be missing the boat a little bit in what's possible to continue to ensure the safety of not only the residents in our community, but those that are first responders. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm moving on to Councillor Freeman next. Please go ahead.
I guess when I looked at question 2, I kind of tried to think of it in terms of if I were to ask the broader citizenry what they think the role should be for fire services in the community. I think they would say suppression as first and probably medical as second. And so I think that gives the opportunity to start to think about how do we more broadly increase the conversation and communication around prevention, public education, and you know, in the hopes that inspection and enforcement aren't the only tools for fire prevention. So, you know, for me, I think that those primary roles of suppression and medical response are still going to be the critical pieces. And one of the things that comes to mind to me around the medical response is that it has evolved in the past 4 years such that there's conversation about carrying naloxone kits, or not carrying them, but I know that we do now. And so there's kind of this ongoing balance to be played as it relates to medical response. So I don't know what that looks like going forward, but those are my thoughts on question 2.
And let's see who I have up next. Councillor Vasic, please go ahead.
Thanks, through you, Mayor Jaworski. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment about education and prevention. And I mean, I believe in education, and I wanted to tie it back to what Councillor Freeman said earlier around just the data. What I'm really curious about, and I hope can inform what kind of prevention and education that fire services does to really kind of narrow and focus resources on what's most effective. So I'm just not sure what education is effective. Like when the fire truck parked on our street and went door to door, like that was super fun, especially for kids to come and see the fire truck. And you know, they go door to door to see if people have working fire alarms, make sure they know about the batteries, things like that. Then there's like the online communication. I actually don't even know how, other than online and with the trucks going around and maybe open houses to fire, like to the fire stations, how you do the education and prevention work. So I'd be curious to understand better how that's done, and then how effectiveness is evaluated, if that's even quantifiable in any way. I'm sure there's some qualitative ways that you measure that. So I'm just curious about what's most effective and how we can make sure that we're putting our resources, I mean, because fire services, I think, is a highly resourced and necessarily so service, but that's also one of the reasons why it's highly criticized in some ways. And so if there are areas where we can really focus our resources and better understand where we need to focus our resources, I think that education and prevention might be one of those. So I'd be really interested in a really robust evaluation of public education and prevention for that reason.
Thank you, Councillor Vasic. And just to confirm, those were questions you want the Fire Master Plan to answer. You weren't looking for any direct feedback right now, or were you?
Oh, no, I wasn't. I just wanted to put my comments for their consideration.
Yeah, and I would say that certainly the fire kitchen that we run for new students, that's always a highlight to see in action. For the new students, I mean the ones coming to campus, that's always good to see in action. And you look at that cohort of students that we have coming in. So certainly that is a great information for the people who look at the Fire Master Plan, whether it be this term of council or next. Councillor Bonagor, please go ahead.
Thank you, and through you, Mayor Jaworski. Just some kind of, again, broad feedback. You know, that there is so much being asked of our fire department, but I see questions like this, they bring a risk of a creeping mandate, because you're already asked to do so much, and this is, you know, these questions can be so broad that we might just end up with this long list of extra stuff you're being asked to do, which I think is not particularly helpful for the fire department, let alone, you know, people trying to assess the plans. From what I also approached this as Councillor Freeman did, you know, thinking what do I think would be the most likely responses from kind of residents that I've sort of spoken to around the area. And I think the key focuses with, you know, looking at it through that lens would likely be fire response and prevention efforts. I certainly agree with Councillor Vasic's comments about education. I think I'd want to see some kind of strategic and robust plans attached to that. I think just I won't say any more. I think she covered it well. And in response to Councillor Freeman's comments, so she highlighted medical as what she thought would be like the second most important. But I'd be surprised if it was that way from at least from the perspective of the residents in my area, just because I think the broader public likely considers medical, or at least primary medical, to be a matter of the EMS or like the ambulance service, with secondary assistance from fire and police. That may not reflect what's happening on the ground, but I think that's kind of likely reflecting the general population's understanding of the situation. So I think if you're looking at these roles that the fire service should be filling, I'd want to see in a strat plan whether you see fire as primary medical, secondary support where possible. How do you fit into that broader piece so that we're not seeing a massive duplication of services? I think that's what I'd want to see somewhere in there. It's just like even just exploring that topic. Thank you, Mayor.
Well, you all have stolen my input, because that's exactly where I see a scope creep. We want to avoid that, notwithstanding the fact that we are often on scene first. I think we're in good hands with the paramedic experience that we have at the leadership level in Waterloo Fire Rescue, but I think they've heard that loud and clear that is this an issue that's perhaps advocacy with respect to more ambulances on the road, placement of ambulances. I think that it needs to be a little bit in that context. Not saying the Fire Master Plan has to address that, but it should have certainly insights into that with respect to not duplicating efforts as was stated. And I don't see anything further. I'll do a last call on that. And I will turn it back to John, either for questions of clarity on Q2 input or to introduce Q3.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just two very quick comments about Q2. First of all, our reports are based on science. So if there are journal studies about a subject, we'll quote the journal studies. We'll tell how they apply to Waterloo and what sort of effect we see. The approaches of the journal studies, such as for medical response, fire response, and so on, public education, and how that would affect the operation of the fire service. With respect to a comment that was made about a creeping mandate, yes, we agree that has a tendency to happen. And again, with journal information and good scientific backing, we'll be able to indicate where fire has a strong contribution to make, perhaps as primary, and where they may be secondary. So we'll certainly back up all that information. The last question was about the highest priority that Council would like to see answered in the 10-year Fire Master Plan. Again, that's pretty broad, but it's sort of the question that says, are there any burning subjects that Council would really like to see approached and answered?
And we have a few hands up. Councillor Henry, Councillor Hanmer, and I do know Councillor Bodley has a good idea, because he's told it to me already.
So a few things here. At the highest level, I want to understand the Fire Master Plan in context. There's a lot of what will come out, and what's traditionally come out at least, is around, it emerges from the sort of what used to be called the simplified risk assessment, the community risk assessment. But that's fire specific in terms of the community risk assessment for what those needs are. But there are lots of risks that exist in a community that council has an obligation to balance. So what I'm looking to sort of understand and get addressed is how this part of it best informs and fits into the overall balance of risks that we face. And I'll give you an example that came up. Councillor Veith's ward in particular, I know she remembers this, but we had a conversation around particular traffic calming interventions and around response time impacts, and balance that off against the known impacts of what happens when you have speeding cars in neighborhoods and the risk to public safety and harm and injury that comes from that. And I would add to that flavor of conversation, which we will face and are facing and have faced, the overarching sort of climate change risks that Councillor Bonagor has sort of touched on and raised, and how we look through those lens of the things we need to do to mitigate climate change, involve vehicles, powered vehicles moving a lot more slowly in a lot of places, and that has a service time response, but it has a safety response in terms of how people get around, and it has a climate change mitigation response, which is at a very high level a very important thing for our community and every community to address. So at the highest level, that's the balance that we're going to grapple with receiving the report, and I will be curious if there's any input we can see from the master plan around how we balance that. More specific into the fire service, there's just a couple of questions that have been in my mind for a while, and that says we grow up rather than out. Our traditional response time metric and thinking around that has been around servicing low density residential at the increasingly wide edges of the city. But we also have to mount an attack with sufficient response into mid and high rise buildings, of which we're getting an increasing number of, particularly in the center of Waterloo, more than at the, not exclusively, but more than at the periphery, and how we're supposed to think about those when we're taking a look at how we position resources and think about resources at the city. And then the other one on those resources is a question around timing and who. We've offered automatic aid to some of our neighbors because that's a better response for them. Are there places where our neighbors could provide a better automatic response to us rather than us resourcing that directly? Is that more efficient or not in some places? And the timing around investments and how specific that timing needs to be able to address the concerns in the review. Is this a budgetary lockdown that one needs to do this by year X, or is it over the next period of time we need to make that decision? Because I keep in mind that we have a long-term financial plan that's identifying timing of revenue sources and timing of expenditures that we can use to be able to make some adjustments on particularly big ticket items, and when they come through that might mitigate the impact to residents. And I'm curious, and I think council will be curious on how much flexibility is helpful in there, so that we can sort of balance those financial risks to the public as well, in addition to just the fire risk. So those are my three bucket high level questions on my list.
Thank you very much. Over to Councillor Hanmer, please.
Thank you, Mayor. I think my comments may be following on a similar kind of vein. Again, keeping in the context that we are a service within multiple other services. So what are some of the leading practices, and also do a bit of an assessment on where we currently are in relation to those leading practices. And the follow-up questions that would be, where do we have to go and how do we have to get there, and what might be the sequencing. And it could be everything from equipment needs, training needs, location, and my second one was location of firehouses. Given that we are expanding and being in one of those periphery wards, we do have expansion happening, and always a question of what do we do with the west end of the city. So I would hope that we would address that location of the firehouses. And then, as Councillor Henry has talked about, our neighbors, and whether it's our big city neighbors or our township neighbors, what's the impact on response times in that new circle. And then my third big question would be along the lines of, as we are getting denser and higher in some locations, what's the equipment that we need, and then what's the training also of the staff who will be running that equipment that's required, and whether it's a year 1 look or a year 10 kind of thing. So getting some idea of the timing for it and the essence of when we have to have some of these things in place. Thinking about the presentation we had earlier today about exponential growth in certain sectors and lots more people coming, just how do we have to match that with our fire services master plan? Thank you.
Next up, Councillor Freeman.
Thank you, through you, Mayor Jaworski. I think that Councillor Hanmer and Councillor Henry covered most of what I wanted to say. The only other thought that came to mind in terms of priority is understanding impacts of decision making. So if options are provided, shall we say, with regard to things like location of fire stations, types of equipment, timing on investment, and etc., how that does affect the fire insurance rating for the broader citizenry. Because I think if, and maybe my understanding is incorrect and someone from the fire services team can respond to this, but in the last fire master plan, I remember that we were very much impressed upon the fact that more broadly, the citizens will have to invest in fire services either through increased home insurance rates or through investment in permanent asset, shall we say. And so understanding that relationship and having a communications tool around that piece, I think would be helpful. So if someone can speak to that, I'd appreciate it. Maybe things have changed since we did our last fire master plan as it relates to fire insurance and the implications associated with asset investment.
And for clarity, that was for input for the fire master plan, or is that a question that you had on your mind now to help inform your future input?
Well, it's just that in terms of what's the highest priority that the master plan needs to answer, I'd like to know whether or not that fire safety rating and the relationship to fire insurance still remains a priority from a fire services perspective. Because maybe it doesn't. Like maybe fire master plans have evolved in some ways such that that's not a critical piece, but that was certainly something that was really impressed upon us last time.
I'll just ask John for any input based on what the 2022 lens.
Thank you. This is very interesting. I'll try to sum it up, sort of 10 years of information in 60 seconds. We've been chasing the idea of insurance relative to assets, let's call it resources, fire resources, since we did a review of the fire and EMS in the City of Toronto. We've talked to Fire Underwriter Survey. We've talked to people who have worked for Fire Underwriter Survey. We've reached out to the insurance community, and even Fire Underwriter Survey says, well, there is an impact, but it sometimes varies. In a small community, it's the whole community that's impacted. In a large community, it could be a building that may or may not be impacted. The insurance industry responses have ranged from giving us specifics, like saying on a $800,000 building, the location of a fire station might make $15 a year difference. On a $25 million a year building, or $25 million building, it might make $5,000 a year difference. And the insurance services themselves have said that sometimes they don't take Fire Underwriter Survey into account, and at other times they say it has some influence, but so does policing, crime rates, floods, various things like that, because Fire Underwriter Survey deals with fire, which is not as large a part of insurance as it once was because there's fewer fires. So taking all that into account, what we're saying is that each community has to be looked at in isolation as to whether there's really going to be an impact. And it's very, very difficult to get an answer because it's hard to be specific. If it was one building, then somebody might be able to answer. But when it's looking at it on a community basis, it's very difficult to answer.
That answer was incredibly helpful. Thank you. So, you know, maybe the fuss rating isn't one of the highest priorities that needs to be covered in this master plan, and the other things that Councillor Hanmer and Councillor Henry have mentioned are more of a priority. That was very helpful. Thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor, if I could, the one thing I will say is that doing things like driving down the number of fires and simply reducing that will have a good effect on insurance rates. Certainly response might make a difference to insurance rates, but if you drive down the fires by even 2 or 3 a year in a community, it will also have an impact on insurance rates.
Fair enough. Thank you very much. Next up, I have Councillor Bodley. Please go ahead.
Excuse me. Yeah, thank you. Through you, Mayor Jaworski. I think my colleagues have done a really great job, so I'm just going to layer in a little bit here and just say that the questions that I'm hoping to have answered in the fire master plan are sort of really how does the fire master plan integrate into some of the particularly more recent plans that Councillor Henry sort of tangentially at least related on. We know what our transportation master plan is suggesting with respect to speed limits and traffic calming and the number of cars in the community, trails, cycling, et cetera, et cetera. How does the fire master plan integrate into that? The Transform WR plan, community climate action plan, and perhaps the forthcoming corporate climate action plan, how does it tie into that? And particularly the forthcoming official plan changes that speak to the density and increased intensification, not just with respect to vertical response in high density buildings, which is referenced in the document that was shared with council so far, but also with respect to things like the potential of tiny homes and multi-residential multi-generational residential single-family homes and secondary suites and coach houses and things like that. How does that impact fire response, and how is the fire master plan sort of addressing those things to help council achieve its strategic goals over the course of the next 10 years? So I'll just leave it there. Thank you, Mayor Jaworski.
Thank you very much. And I will go over to Councillor Bonagor.
Thank you, through you, Mayor Jaworski. I really had just two big questions that I would hope the master plan could at least weigh in on. The first is, how does it justify the department's increasing slice of municipal funding? And the other one is, how will the fire department change the current status quo, both through operations and equipment, for climate change and intensification? So those are the two big questions that are out there for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bonagor. And then probably I'm not sure they're actually the highest priority questions, but I would like to see something with respect to certainly with climate change, flooding is more prevalent, and we saw that a couple of years ago around Grey Silo Golf Course and Conestoga. And I think we all had to call in the cooperative boat from Cambridge Fire Rescue, and just how we might need to address anything like that. And I certainly would say that a priority would be for our student-oriented housing, our tall buildings, to not have fires. So I think there's probably an opportunity there to continue what we've been doing so successfully in order to keep our students safe, and of course our residents in our other tall buildings. I don't see any other hands going up. I'm going to turn it back to John for a second, and I'll go back to Sandy to close things off.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We appreciate this this time. We're quite excited to listen to your comments because it's the direction that we would take in a fire master plan. So I think this will work out quite well and answer your questions. Having said that, Mr. Mayor, that's it.
Thank you very much, and I'll turn over to Sandy and/or Jake, who is also on board here. Sandy, any final commentary?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, members of council. These are very good comments that you've given us. You've given us a great thing to think about as well. I would just want to thank you for that. And I think on our agenda, next agenda is even the report too. So maybe you have some questions about that as well. Thank you.
Excellent. And with that, that ends the workshop, and we move on to staff reports. As you heard, first up is the Fire Master Plan Update 2022. DC Sandy Van Solm is here to answer any questions. Does anybody have any questions on this item? I see Councillor Henry's ready to move it. Councillor Bonagor, please go ahead with your question.
Oh, sorry, Mayor, it was more of a comment. So if someone has a question.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, this is just, thank you, through you, Mayor. I just wanted to flag that I just had some alarm bells were going off with me with just, fire services accounts for a quarter of the city's budget, and for every tax dollar that comes into the city from property taxes, 24 cents of that goes to fire. We've just been talking about all the reasons why, so I'm not trying to say that this is erroneous. It's just that, with this report forecasting a possible new fire station with, potentially 4 million in operating funds, we're looking at, if my rusty math is anything to lean on here with that caveat attached, that's a potential 5% tax increase just for operations. And if my concern is if something is going to get cut for these efforts, it's not likely to be roads and infrastructure because those have legal requirements. We're looking at more likely to be climate and community efforts. And this is just the concern for me. At some point, I suspect we're going to have to tackle some unpleasant questions, such as how much is too much? And what role do various pieces of the puzzle, from provincial rules to union contracts, play into that? And are these requirements, which are in place to try and protect the public good, now unintentionally undermining the public good by potentially restricting our efforts on other really important files? It's a difficult conversation. It's not one I intend to raise now, but it's just some concerns that have been bubbling away in the background for me. And I think it's just a discussion the city will need to have at some point. And judging by the very clear needs in the community that are included in this report, I would expect we'd probably have to have it soon. That's all. Thank you, Mayor.
Yeah, fair enough. Councillor Henry, please go ahead.
Yeah, and I appreciate Councillor Bonagor's comments. I was sort of tangentially mentioning this, as the report indicates. This is not a surprise for council insofar as there was a note as part of the budget process. It's been in the forecast for a number of years, and there's been discussions for a number of years that you need new fire stations. Certain elements of operations are more bumpy than others, and this is one of them, because you can't go 4.1 fire stations, 4.2 fire stations, 4.3 fire stations. It's very sharp in terms of those. In other communities, when they have made the decision and felt they've needed to add one, do have bumpy tax increases in order to accommodate that. And staff are identifying that they would propose a smoothing effect for the next council to consider. My question into the process at a high level was trying to get at this. Our long-term financial plan identifies, which council has seen as well, identifies that in 2031, when we made the last payment on the Rim Park lease, there is a number of operating dollars that are available. We've been forecasting half of it going towards operational costs and half of it going towards infrastructure costs. What that balance should ultimately be is an interesting question. But in my mind, there is an important conversation about aligning to the best of our ability the timing of significant operational impacts with the availability of significant operational funding, and trying to look at how all of the different needs we have line up over the medium and long term, and do our best to find some alignment between those and to make choices along the way for timing of big investments and big changes. So I think it's useful that council will get a fire master plan. Hopefully it will answer some of these questions around need and timing and balancing of risks. But it's also why we receive long-term financial plan reports and these look-aheads in the budgeting process, so we can start to answer those and ask and answer those difficult questions around what choices we're making and when we're making them. So I think we're going to have, and the next council will have, lots of good information as they face what is always a difficult choice, which is budgets. So I appreciate Councillor Bonagor's flagging and comments, because it's important for those to be foremost in every councillor's mind, and certainly any councillor that deals with a budget over the next few years.
Thank you both. With that, I have a mover in Councillor Henry, a seconder in Councillor Hanmer. I see no further commentary. We'll begin the voting with Ward 1, please.
Councillor Hanmer in favor.
Councillor Bodley in favor.
Councillor Veith in favor.
Councillor Freeman in favor.
Councillor Bassick in favor.
Councillor Henry in favor.
Councillor Bonagor in favor.
And the mayor's in favor too. That carries unanimously. All the best, Sandy, Jake, and Richard, in bringing forward the Fire Master Plan. Moving forward to item B. Well, the very much anticipated Affordable Housing Strategy Discussion Paper and Recommendations, prepared by Michelle Lee, with a presentation by Michelle. We'll just wait for a moment while that is pulled up. And there she be. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you, Mayor Jaworski and Council, for the opportunity to speak. I'm going to try and keep it short and just cover some highlights of the presentation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michelle Lee, and I'm a policy planner at the city. And this discussion paper is really intended to set the stage for what we might explore in the final affordable housing strategy coming to Council this fall. Next slide, please. So I wanted to start off first by just covering off what we mean by affordable housing in the discussion paper, and to provide some rationale behind why we've chosen this particular definition. We use the provincial definition that's provided for us in the provincial policy statement. One of the reasons why we've chosen to do this is that the provincial policy statement actually sets out direction for area municipalities like the City of Waterloo to carry out planning, including planning for affordable housing. And so since we're obliged through this provincial policy statement to plan for affordable housing, it makes a lot of sense that we carry over this definition for something we're already supposed to be planning for, that we carry over this definition into the affordable housing strategy as well. It's not a perfect definition by any means, and I don't know that there is a perfect definition, but we feel that it provides enough flexibility that should council decide that it wants to focus on a particular area within that broader definition, it can do so by looking at, for example, housing more specifically for low income households, or housing for moderate income households, or council could choose to look at actions that address housing for both categories. Also, we feel that the definition is somewhat flexible in that, because it has a multi-pronged approach, it really does adjust when markets increase. It adjusts a little bit so that the definition still makes sense in the context of housing prices and incomes. Next slide, please. The strategy that we are proposing is really intended to be a framework so that we can coordinate the city's actions, that the actions that we choose are actually working together to achieve set out goals and that we are allocating the resources we need to make sure we're successful in carrying out those actions. The approach we've are recommending to council is that we take a look at the main drivers of what is causing a decline in affordability for housing, and particularly looking at those main drivers that fall into the realm of municipal influence or municipal control, and that we take a look at those drivers and identify actions that we could carry out to address those drivers. So that's what you see in the discussion paper, is a set of drivers that fall within the municipal sphere, and then a series of actions that we could consider that specifically address those challenges. We know that we can't do everything, even though we would like to. So we are proposing that the final affordable housing strategy prioritize amongst these 30 actions that have been presented as possibilities to council. We're going to need to make some hard choices and choose only those actions that we feel we're going to get a lot of return on our investment, as I've heard spoken to today. And then finally, we have a scope that's being proposed for the strategy that really is trying to capitalize on our particular role as a lower tier municipality, as an enabler of development, as a supporter of regional programs and regional affordable housing development. But what we're proposing in this discussion paper is that we not replicate the roles of other orders of government that may be better suited or have the funding necessary to carry out certain activities. In particular, we're feeling that the region of Waterloo, which is the designated service provider for this region, and that has access to significant funding from higher levels of government, they are probably better suited to actually provide, construct, and manage and operate affordable housing in the region. But there's a lot of things we can do to enable, support, facilitate their work without replicating it. So that's kind of the angle that we're trying to capture here in this discussion paper. Next slide. We've identified four key factors that are influencing the decline in affordability. And I do want to reiterate, we know that there are many, many factors that go beyond this short list of four that are regional, national, global, many of which are really outside of our ability to control and manipulate. What we're identifying here is four general factors that we think we do have some control over and that we can make a change. Next slide. The discussion paper also identifies some targets that I wanted to bring to your attention, just in case they got buried in the fairly long document. These actually are based on existing work that has either come to council or come to regional council in recent years, or that have been provided to us through direction from the province and through the region. So one of those targets is the requirement for a certain number of new housing units just to accommodate the growth in our population. So using our development charges background study as an example of some of this forecasting work, which largely depends on the same forecasting work that has been done by the province to inform the growth plan. We're looking at about 8,000 additional units needed to support anybody and everybody that will be moving into the city in the coming decade. Within that, we have the region of Waterloo affordable housing target of 30%. That would be 30% of all new units would be considered affordable within that definition that I mentioned earlier by the province. That target has already been set by the region of Waterloo, and we are, through the PPS, supposed to be taking that target ourselves and applying it to our own work. And so it's proposed through this strategy that we do that very thing, and that we be a little bit more deliberate and intentional in that action. And then last of all, we have a Waterloo housing need and demand analysis that took a look at the situation in Waterloo, the housing needs and demands and what types of housing were being provided. And we've concluded that we have a higher need for rental housing than most communities because of our unique situation of having 3 post-secondary schools in the community, as well as a lot of young professionals that may be a little bit more transient or maybe don't have the incomes yet to purchase homes. And so we're proposing a general target of about 33% of new units within the next 10 years should probably be rental. I did want to add one clarifying point as well, that aside from the new housing target that's in that blue circle, so that broader umbrella, the rental and the affordable housing targets are aspirational. They're goals that we're suggesting we should be striving for through a variety of means, through encouraging policies, enabling policies, through some regulations in our zoning bylaw, but they wouldn't necessarily be a mandated threshold because we just simply don't have the tools to require that type of threshold across the city. So we're looking at these targets as an objective to strive for rather than a target that like something that might be set through an inclusionary zoning policy, which is much more specific and market-based. Next slide, please. So we have 6 goals that we've identified that we feel address the main drivers that are causing challenges to our local affordable housing right now. We have identified 30 actions within those 6 goals that we think could be promising. They are at this point fairly preliminary, and we are looking to receive feedback on those actions. Are there actions that we maybe missed? Are there actions that council or the community feels strongly that are really taking us down the wrong path? So we're hoping that this discussion paper can help fuel that conversation and give us some feedback on where we might be best using our resources and where we should be focusing our efforts. Next slide. This is my last slide, and it's really just to give you a sense of what our next steps are. Today, we're asking council to approve the discussion paper and direct staff to continue on this exercise of really homing in on what specific actions we feel would best suit the City of Waterloo to achieve the various goals we've identified. We'll be developing the final strategy over the course of the coming months between April and September. We hope to bring a final strategy to council for consideration in the fall. And then the actions that once approved, the strategy will have a number of actions, and those actions will be implemented through a variety of means, including the 2023 budget work that's going to be underway soon, the strategic planning process that council is going to be undertaking, and various other long-term budgeting and work planning that is going to be carried out over the coming year. So that's all I've got for my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions or comments.
Well done, Michelle. Right on the 10-minute-ish mark, so very good for you. I know there's a lot more to know, and I know council really appreciates the in-depth report that comes here with all sorts of ideas in it. I'll just pause for a second while we see if we have questions from council. But I do know to council, certainly Michelle did highlight the fact that the 30% of housing being affordable is certainly aspirational. This is something that came up at the Economic Development Committee as to how will this happen, and that is a very good clarification by staff of setting the aspirations should something come our way in terms of a tool to address things other than inclusionary zoning. With that, I'll go over to Councillor. Oh, I'm a bit behind here. First up is Councillor Henry with questions, and then Councillor Vasek, Bodley, Bonagor, and a lot of questions and comments. And maybe give consideration to maybe letting questions go first, and then comments go later. Thank you.
Sure. So I appreciate Michelle, all the work that staff is doing. And when I see approved strategy in fall 2022, I read that as, December or really Q1 2023, knowing there are going to be things that happen over the next few months. So question that I had relating to some of the demolition control, aspects that are in here. I know there's been some reference to a couple of GTA municipalities that is sort of requiring that if you're demolishing a building, that there is some replacement, not just of units, but of units of similar levels of affordability as part of preservation. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to the nuance of that. I know I sent staff early in the process some of the OP policies and zoning bylaw pieces out of Hamilton to try to preserve housing through demolition, at least in requiring new construction to have this. But I'm wondering if you can walk us through what we're thinking so far about that, and how sort of possible that is. Is there good sort of examples from other municipalities that they've done this? It's withstood appeals. It's working. Do we have a sense of any of those things yet?
Through you, Mayor. I would say that at this stage, we do know that we have the ability to apply this type of approach through the Municipal Act. And as you mentioned, there are a number of municipalities that have either adopted these types of strategies. And just for those who maybe just need a refresher, this is a strategy that would, in the review of a demolition application, the city would be able to require the applicant to ensure that they were replacing the lost units with those of a similar size and price, and other conditions could also potentially be applied. So we know that there are some municipalities that have enacted this. However, we definitely need to do a lot more digging to determine, has it been effective? Has it had the impact that was intended? Has it had any indirect, unanticipated impacts, which can sometimes happen with these types of regulatory approaches? So I guess what I would say is it's early times yet. We're looking at whether or not this does make sense for the city. And I think we also need to quantify how many units are we actually losing to demolition, and what types of units are they getting replaced by, so that we really understand what's being lost and what potentially could be gained with additional regulation. Does that help?
Yeah, that's a good start in terms of where we are in the process of figuring that out. Two other sort of ones jumped out at me. One was sort of the comment, I think it's G5A4, around bridge loans, and that being something that came up. I know I've heard that as well. The gap between a nonprofit co-op housing trust seeing land that would be suitable for either preserving or building affordable housing, and then actually securing funding from CMHC or other partners to do it, is too long for them to be able to act on that opportunity. And so the theory has come to the municipality. Have we, and you've also commented about the region being sort of really the designated housing provider for sort of non-market housing. So, have we sort of thought about the role of bringing in expanding municipal ownership of on a temporary basis to sort of take land opportunities that way, like we sort of do on a longer term basis for the industrial land account? Have we thought about sort of the region? Has there been communication with the region on sort of their role on potentially being a deeper pocket on that for quick turnaround as part of their portfolio? Is there a conversation with, say, the community foundation and their sort of new investment approach, where they're looking at sort of public good investments in those short-term turnarounds? Can you give me a bit more flavor for other ways to accomplish this other than the lower tier municipality becoming a banker?
Sure. Through you, Mayor. Actually, those are some great ideas. So to answer some of the questions, the region and city staff, actually the region has coordinated a working group with area municipal staff across the region to help us coordinate our incentive programs, or at least to encourage us to work together to coordinate our incentive programs. And this is something that we are raising through that venue as an option, maybe not for the municipality to pursue, but rather for the region to pursue, for the same reasons you've suggested, that they do have deeper pockets, they maybe are better set up to run such a program. And I do know that they are familiar with this complaint or concern that's been raised by affordable housing providers, because some of those same staff that work in the affordable housing sector at the region also sit on the Housing Innovation Roundtable, which is a charitable offshoot of the KW Community Foundation that is looking to also try and solve this problem in a slightly different way. So rather than becoming bankers, this organization is looking at ways that a development organization could be formed, a not-for-profit organization that could then purchase land, parcel it up, and make it available to not-for-profit housing providers at an affordable price, and most importantly, within the time frame that they need it to be available. So, whereas in the open market, the land might be sold before a not-for-profit will be able to coordinate their financing and get their money all together. In this situation, the HIRT, the Housing Innovation Roundtable, is exploring an option to be able to work with the housing provider and wait as long as it takes within reason to allow them to get their finances in order, wait that 9 months for CMHC funding, and then be able to access the parcel of land. So yes, there are a number of ways that this could be tackled. One thing that the municipality could consider, rather than becoming a banker, is supporting this Housing Innovation Roundtable approach through maybe in-kind support or some kind of support to help them get off their feet, because at this point it's still just an idea and not a functioning program. So I think these are all great ideas. Again, I think we're at the very cusp of exploring them, so I'll definitely take those ideas back and weigh them against each other. I'm not very familiar with the industrial land reserve fund that you referenced, and so that's something I can look into as well to see if that's an appropriate model that we could use for this type of thing.
Yeah, I think it's always useful to see what tools we've used for economic development purposes on sort of commercial industrial, and say, well, hold on, affordable housing, places to live, worker housing is an economic development tool too. So some of the same flexibility we show in one place, is there a way we can do it in others? So I appreciate where we are in the pieces. The last question I had was around, I had G5A3 around fees and charges waiving. This is something that we do on an ad hoc way today with sort of whatever funding source we can identify at the time. And the approach that seems to be emerging now is to say, well, we'll have a grant program, but it can pay for those. You just have to use the money that we might grant you to pay for those things. But maybe we'll waive those in the future, but that's sort of a medium long-term priority. Is the reason it's showing up lower down on the priority scale there a matter of sort of funding and resources to deal with that, or is it about that not being the sort of surprise fees if you're an unsophisticated developer, like many nonprofits getting into this space? There's sort of a surprise fee that shows up, and but those aren't actually issues. And so is it about this not being a big concern or a big area to address, or is it about just lining up funding and timing, and that's something that we'll get to later, and you can use your grant money if you get it to pay for some of them?
Through you, Mayor, I would say that the main reason why it's identified as more of a medium-term goal, or sorry, action, is because we don't have any funding identified for it, and so that funding would need to be found somewhere to help offset the cost of the waiving of the fees. So that's the primary reason, and it is something. So I just did want to add also that the weighting was a very preliminary weighting, because obviously we haven't done a super in-depth review of the costs of each of these types of actions and how they weigh out against each other. And so what we're proposing to do is work with our finance review team, who have a fairly good understanding of our budget constraints, the various pots of money we have, how much can we afford within our existing framework, and how much, if we're to adopt some of these things, how much more would we need to find? And so I think the main thrust is, if we are to adopt an action where we're going to waive fees and charges, doing an ad hoc approach is probably not as ideal as having a system in place where there's a little bit of predictability, not only from the funding standpoint, but also for the applicant, who knows that that option is available and can potentially access it. So I guess the sum of it is that it is a promising tool. We would like to explore it further, but the reason why it is lower down on the list is that we don't have funding for it at the moment.
That's fair. I'll have some comments later, Mayor, but we'll keep going with questions. I'll cede back the floor.
And with that, we go to Councillor Vasek.
Thanks, through you, Mayor Jaworski. Can you hear me? I switched from my headphones.
Yeah, you're sounding good.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Michelle, for everything. I have 4 questions, unless I have some follow-ups. And one is about the missing middle, which shows up a lot in this report. New Zealand has just made it easier for the missing middle to be built without sort of being challenged at the municipal level. And there's just some great stuff in this report about the missing middle. And anyways, I'm not going to go into talking about how much I love the missing middle, and I've wanted to see that for a long time. So I'm really excited to see that in here. And I guess my question is, how can that piece be expedited, and how soon can we expect to see permissions for this kind of building happen in Waterloo?
Through you, Mayor, I think actually it is a good news story in that the primary means by which we can get this type of housing enabled and potentially constructed is by looking at our official plan and our zoning bylaw, making sure that they are providing the correct framework to support them and not stifling them inadvertently. And it just so happens that we are undertaking an official plan review and update as we speak. And so while we flagged these items in the affordable housing strategy, we are also working on them behind the scenes and exploring these ideas in the official plan review and update. So I think from that standpoint, it's good in terms of timeliness, because the work is somewhat already underway and being considered. And we're kind of using this opportunity as a touch point with council, that if this was not the direction that council wanted to see, then we would perhaps shift our direction in the official plan review and update. We felt fairly confident that this was a direction that we figured council would want to see. And so this is why we're presenting it through the affordable housing strategy, kind of as almost like an update of, this is what we are currently doing and will continue to do unless told otherwise. So I think that's the primary mechanism that we need to make it happen. And I take your point about New Zealand's approach. They have a slightly different system, but we can definitely do a lot at the City of Waterloo to look at where we maybe are overly restrictive on our densities and housing types, and look at opportunities to expand those to allow for more housing types and more missing middle.
Thank you. And I can't remember off the top of my head where we're at with the OP review process. Do you remember the timelines of that off the top of your head?
Through you, Mayor, yes, we have a brief update that's going to be coming to council shortly. It's actually going to be built into the regional official plan review update. There's going to be a small subsection that gives council a little flavor of where we're at. We do hope to start drafting some preliminary policy work this fall. We are actually working on it as we speak, but really getting the meat and potatoes out into the public realm this fall is our goal. So by fall, I guess, is what I would count on for council to keep your eyes peeled for some more public materials and actual policies to look at and to comment on.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thanks, Michelle. My second question is around if there's a connection between, and I think there is, between property standards and affordable housing conversations, kind of moving beyond that pristine lawn from the 1950s and as an exclusionary tactic for homeowners or renters who might have different perceptions or abilities to keep their lawns and properties looking as expected and that kind of standard. And right now the city has a survey open about naturalization and changing property standards. So I'm wondering if you can comment on if you see any overlap between those property standards and naturalization conversations and the affordable housing conversation.
Through you, Mayor, I think it's definitely something we could explore. At the outset, I think we do want to make sure that from a basic safety and maintenance standpoint, that property standards for affordable housing and other types of housing are all the same. When it comes to more of the aesthetics, I think there's lots of conversation that could be had about what are the options here? Are there any appropriate, safe, cost-saving measures that would keep affordable housing projects thriving and with spaces that people can use, but they maybe don't need that lawn maintenance as much as we've required in the past. So I'll take that point back and touch base with the staff that are managing that project and see what we can come up with.
Okay, thanks. And it kind of ties into my next question about NIMBYism, right? So it's that idea that, well, for sure we need properties to be safe and have a minimum standard, of course. It is really about the aesthetics and that expectation, like keeping up with the Joneses, that idea. So so that previous question ties into this, which is in goal 6, to build community awareness. I just wanted to know if I was missing something or if it wasn't in there, but something that would assist the community with challenging NIMBYism.
Yes, through you, Mayor. And Councillor Vasic, I know you did mention this in an email, and I'm glad you did, because the goal of addressing NIMBYism isn't identified as explicitly as it perhaps should have been in this discussion paper. There are a lot of implicit references to it through, for example, making sure that we have appropriate zoning that allows or that identifies all housing types as of right in appropriate locations that we've pre-planned to support so that you don't have to go through a planning process to enable these housing types. So that's one example of where it's in there, but there are other things that we could probably do and be more explicit about it in our actions to make sure it doesn't get lost in the shuffle. I'll just say that 2 other things that come to mind with respect to where sharing information with the community about housing as a human need and a human right as opposed to a privilege. There's lots of opportunity for us to use the city's website and our communication tools around affordable housing and around residential development in general that we could build onto that and tell the story of how housing is so important for so many reasons, both for individuals and for the community. So I think we'll take that back as well and look to make sure that we've properly addressed that and say it more explicitly.
Yes, thank you. That would be wonderful. And my final question is beyond what the city has tools to do, but is just really part of like right at the front of the conversation for me personally, which is just, I think, I guess there's no really nice way to say this, but that entitlement that I think many of us feel as homeowners to be able to now sell our houses for like 3, 4 more times what we purchased them for. And that's sort of like a, yeah, it's a sense of a feeling of entitlement, a feeling of freedom, maybe. I'm not entirely sure what it is, but I guess, and the strategy that you're going to present to us is going to have many solutions to mitigate that or attempt to mitigate that. So I know that that's the focus of this strategy, but I guess my question is, what can we do, whether it's around education or connecting with the right sectors, advocating with the right sectors to make any changes in that regard? Like, yeah, I don't actually know what the solution is, but I think it's just expedited so quickly, the home prices, household prices, that I'm not really sure what we can do as a sort of broader society and what the municipality's role could be.
Through you, Mayor. I think so. I do think that there's a lot of overlap here with the previous point on NIMBYism. You know, so much of this is about culture and expectations and people's desires and wants. You know, they grow up wanting to own housing, and once they do, they really want to protect their asset, and they feel threatened when there is change that maybe affects what they see as their asset as much as it is their home. And that is a really difficult nut to crack. I think there's a number of things we could do. You know, part of them I mentioned in the previous response, which was, you know, just making better use of our existing communication tools. So when we're talking about how the city plans and how we grow and that kind of thing, building into that a broader understanding of housing as a home as opposed to an investment. And recognizing that that is an important part of how cities grow and become prosperous is that it provides safe, suitable homes for people. We do have an action that I think it's fairly vague, so it maybe kind of gets lost. It's at the very end of the discussion paper, and that is working with for-profit, not-for-profit housing providers and also poverty reduction organizations, basically all the organizations that touch on the issue of housing, and working with them to understand their challenges that they face and NIMBY and the cultural aspects of housing in general are a big part of those challenges. And so I think, you know, we can learn a bit more about from our partners throughout the city that are working in housing on these issues. We could probably work with the KW Real Estate Association. You know, they do a lot of great webinars and that kind of thing, and facilitating or supporting them by providing information at their upcoming seminars is another way to help tackle it. So there's lots of little ways. I can't think of a knock it out of the park answer. But I think there's certainly lots of little things we can do to chip away at that challenge that you've mentioned.
You most definitely knocked it out of the park. Like, if you could see me, you'd see me active listening, my mm-hms and my like and stuff. But I think you touch on a really important point there, and it's just the language of culture, or like the cultural aspects of housing. And it almost feels to me like, I don't know if that can be a recommendation in the strategy itself, but to highlight the cultural piece, because it speaks to some of the things that I'm obviously like most drawn to in these conversations, which is around the you know, housing as a human right and as a home and not an investment, like you said, and NIMBYism and property standards and, you know, keeping up with the Joneses, and then it also ties into the other thing that I emailed you about, which is just the name of the concierge service. That name doesn't necessarily reflect what that case management role is supposed to do, but rather conjures images of a concierge at a fancy condo building or something, right? So I almost wonder, and I'm just going to leave it for your consideration, if there's some way to capture that cultural piece. I mean, you named it, and I think that that's really an important point of it, because even the term NIMBYism really puts people off. I'm not a NIMBY, like, you know, no one wants to be a NIMBY, right? So it's really that cultural aspect that we're trying to move forward, that everyone wants to move forward. And if we all have a stake in the cultural aspect of housing as a human right, then we might be able to get behind some of those other strategies that might kind of create some resistance in people. So anyways, just that, so food for thought, I guess. Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you.
Next up, I have Councillor Bodley. Please go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Mayor Jaworski. My first part is I apologize. I'm going to have to make my comment first because it rolls into my question. So I apologize for that, Mayor Jaworski. But I guess broadly speaking, anybody who is listening to this, this report is just extraordinarily well done and touches on so many different actions that the city can undertake. And it's really exciting to be at the forefront of this. And I'm excited to see the passion that Michelle and staff have put into this, and all of the different things that are under our purview that we can tackle. And so, like I say, I'm just really excited to see us diving into this. And so when I talk about what I'm about to talk about, I don't want to suggest that this is the only thing in there, but like Councillor Bassick, the missing middle stuff is really intriguing and interesting to me. And how we tackle that is, I think, of utmost importance when we look at the attainable housing piece and the supply sort of issue. I recognize it's not the only thing. And this report certainly highlights that there are many others, but it's really important. And so one of the things that I just want to be clear about, and I know I mentioned this to you, Michelle, in an email, and I'm just going to mention it publicly, is, you know, everybody seems to be very keen on the idea of the missing middle, and but oftentimes that's whenever we're talking about a taller building going up somewhere. You know, where's the missing middle? Why aren't we building missing middle? Why are we building this tall building? And I think it's really important that we highlight specifically that that when we're talking about the missing middle, we're talking about missing middle in low density residential neighborhoods. We're not talking about missing middle as opposed to these taller buildings, which are still necessary in major transit station areas if we're going to hit our density targets, our climate targets, our transportation targets, et cetera, et cetera. We cannot replace tall and sprawl with missing middle and sprawl. That's not going to be sufficient. So I just wanted to make that very clear. And so as I tie into that, I'm wondering, since you brought up the discussions around the OP and how that's coming forward, I would just like to express my support for an aggressive policy therein when staff are reviewing that. You know, the Affordable Housing Task Force of Ontario draft report said we should allow all municipalities with a population more than 100,000 should allow any type of residential housing up to 4 stories and 4 units on a single residential lot. I'm not necessarily suggesting that I am 100% in favor of that. And I know that there are a couple of things highlighted within the report here, talking about new minor corridor areas and broadening zoning permissions in general in low density neighborhoods. But I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to giving us a bit of a preview of the official plan as to whether or not we are taking heed some of the Affordable Housing Task Force's comments about that. Whether we're looking at broader densities than just secondary units inside the neighborhoods, whether we're looking at things like lot size requirements and setbacks as other ways for us to perhaps achieve that missing middle density, perhaps without permitting 4-story apartment buildings throughout the entire neighborhood. I'm wondering if you could maybe speak to some of those things, please.
Thanks. Through you, Mayor. This is actually my favorite part of the list of opportunities, because I think there's just so much potential here. So yes, we have been following the affordable housing, or the Housing Affordability Task Force, I should call it, from the province. And then recently they've introduced a bill that does not include that provision of requiring 4 stories, 4 units on every property. But certainly we had already flagged increased densities and more housing variety as something that we felt needed to be explored through the current official plan. So in terms of the types of things we are exploring and thinking about, we are, I definitely take your point about the fact that we are talking largely about, basically gentle intensification in neighborhoods, not at the expense of high density in the nodes and corridors. We're still going to need that higher density in the nodes and corridors to support transit, to support the amount of housing supply that we need to accommodate growth. But we are looking for ways to work with the neighborhoods that have been fairly static and not changing to date, to allow for some slightly more intense housing. So for example, I think in the discussion paper we did talk about how a good portion of the city's residential lands are actually zoned for exclusively single detached housing. Where it's appropriate, like from, for example, from a servicing capacity, from a heritage capacity, that kind of thing, we're looking at ways that we can allow for changes to that built form over time. So, we're talking semis, townhouses, that kind of thing, where there might be specific neighborhood constraints, like those examples that I provided. Maybe there'd be a slightly different approach, like using coach houses and additional accessory apartments, that type of thing, converting housing to allow for triplexes within an existing built form, for example. So it's exactly the same from appearances. It just happens to now accommodate 3 units instead of 1. These are all sorts of things that we could explore. And the idea is, instead of using the province's approach of every neighborhood is treated exactly the same with exactly the same brush, I think we have the ability at the local level to look at a more nuanced approach. Not every neighborhood is exactly the same. Not all the servicing is the same. Not all the roads are the same, the access to transit, that type of thing. So we're going to want to apply a more nuanced approach to increasing density. And one last thing I will mention that we are exploring as well is, and I touched on this very briefly in the discussion paper, and that is that we have quite a few nodes and corridors that have not seen the transition that we expect to see. Many corridors are zoned for 6 stories, for example, and we've seen just a very small trickling of new development applications in those areas. So while we've planned for it and we enable it, it's just not happening. So we are going back and looking at those areas and trying to understand, why is it not happening? Are those corridors, for example, too small to accommodate the type of development that would be necessary to actually achieve the height and density limits? Or are they not well suited because they have other site constraints like grading or that kind of thing that make it actually more realistic for them to support a 4-story building, not a 6-story building? In which case, we need to start looking at other places in the city that might be more suitable for additional missing middle, that's maybe not the low density, but sort of that middle ground, 4 to 6 stories. And in addition to that, looking at the existing corridors and asking ourselves, are those boundaries appropriate? Do we need to expand those boundaries to accommodate more land area so that they can actually support the type of development that we envisioned? So those are a bunch of approaches that we are exploring. It will all come out through the official plan review process. So there'll be policies and mapping that gives like a first cut of what we think might be appropriate from a planning perspective, and then we'll hope that the community and council weighs in on what they think of that first cut.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I think, as I say, I would be a proponent of being aggressive in this regard, but I certainly appreciate the value that local expertise and our planning department from a servicing perspective and a host of other things is perhaps the a better way for versus a more nuanced approach, as you say, versus sort of painting every neighborhood with the same brush. So I really look forward to seeing that. I had a bunch of other questions, but you've answered them in the email. I look forward to seeing how they get captured in the forthcoming report. Back to you, Mayor Jaworski. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to Councillor Bonagor.
Thank you, Mayor Jaworski, through you. Thanks, Michelle, for this great report. I do have comments that will come later. There's a lot for Uptown in here that I really like, but I'll save that for the comment section. I do have some questions, and I appreciate that you had already answered a lot of questions that I emailed to you earlier. So I appreciate your openness to my many, many questions. I'm just going to ask some of those publicly, because I think other people might be interested in the answer. So in one of the sections of the report, it was page 17 for anyone playing along at home. The report is discussing city-owned lands and the potential for allocating money from Uptown land sales to affordable housing goals. And in the report, it kind of mentions, could meet those goals elsewhere in the city. But as elsewhere in the report, you very clearly state we need affordable housing in the core. So can you just assure me and those listening at home that displacing affordable housing from the core is not the intent of that section?
Through you, Mayor, that is correct. Yeah, the caveat there of recognizing that there will be some constraints on city-owned lands and there will be some situations where we can't develop or enable the development of residential uses on those lands because of floodplain constraints or other constraints. That caveat isn't intended to suggest that we would then only be interested in reinvesting in housing outside of the core, but rather finding suitable housing or suitable land for housing as an exchange for the land that isn't suitable. So there's a lot to be determined by our economic development colleagues here at the city in terms of how to deal with surplus lands, but I can say that they are looking at all the options with the goal and recognition that affordable housing is needed in the core, as it is throughout the city. So it's not a one or the other.
Perfect. Okay, thank you for that. Now, the report also mentions the lag in housing supply. I know the province likes to say that that's the fault of municipalities, but there are also developments across the city that were approved by previous councils, but they're not acted on, sometimes for years. Like there's one in my ward that was approved in 2013 and nothing's happened on the site yet. It's just languishing. So I'm curious if there's a mechanism through which we can force builders to actually construct their approved plans or entice them to do so. Like, are there mechanisms that we could bring in to kind of get these things built?
Through you, Mayor Jaworski, I think that is a problem I think that many municipalities are facing. They've got this backlog of undeveloped potential from pre-approved plans, and so while on paper it looks like we've got lots of construction in the works, in reality we're still waiting years and years to see the shovels hit the ground. The one tool that I can think of that might be helpful in this regard, and we still have to explore whether or not it would be enough to incent the type of behavior we want to see, is a vacant unit tax that could also be adapted to be a vacant land tax. So if it's land that's sitting or housing that's sitting empty and vacant because of a development application that's been approved and is just sitting there for years and years, if we had the ability to incentivize developers to move forward with those development plans sooner, or otherwise face a reasonable fine or tax on their on their property tax in addition to what they would normally pay. I think that might be one aspect that we could explore. And that is something that our finance review team is working on with, or in conjunction with the region's finance team, because we would need direction from the region to be able to do that. We are not, my understanding is we're not able to just single-handedly declare that we are going to start doing that. And then I believe the region would need approval or some kind of authority given from the province. So that is something that's in the works, and it might help resolve the issue you have mentioned.
Okay, no, that's great. I'm heartened to hear that even just those discussions are happening. Thank you. Just a couple of more questions. This is a fantastic report full of lots of information. We also have excellent resources in our community when we look to the universities. We have specialists in affordable housing and urban housing challenges. Is it intended that the city would be tapping in to kind of the university research capacity and the experts on the campuses in either the formation or the execution of the strategy?
Through you, Mayor, we have been tapping into their expertise in the development of this discussion paper for sure. In fact, we are participating in a research program right now as a supporter, obviously not as a lead, looking at some of the market constraints for why missing middle housing isn't being developed. And that's with Don Parker at the University of Waterloo. So we definitely have an ongoing dialogue with the universities and the colleges regarding housing from a research standpoint. We've also had a lot of interest and interaction from the student associations from a slightly different angle. They're very interested in the provision of housing and the support of students in finding appropriate and affordable housing. So we've been working with them to understand their needs, and I think more work needs to be done to further understand how we can support the challenges they're facing. I have not thought about how the universities and college might be involved in the implementation, but that's something I'll take away and think about. There's, it's such an asset to have them here. And I think there's such a strong interest in all three institutions around housing. So maybe there are some partnerships there that we could explore.
I appreciate that. I'll leave that with you to see if there's anything worth pursuing. And my final question kind of touches on some notes that Councillor Vasic was raising. And it's kind of quite often in our discussions of development proposal, particularly kind of intensification, even that missing middle intensification, quite often you find established property owners they have a loud voice in these discussions, which makes sense. They often live next door, but we don't always hear from the people who could be living there. So it can sometimes turn into a very one-sided conversation. So I'm just wondering, maybe you or someone else from staff could maybe just, and sorry I didn't ask this in advance, it came to me now, but can our engagement on these issues kind of seek a balance so that we aren't kind of privileging the housing haves over the housing have-nots?
Through you, Mayor, that you've just hit the nail on the head. That is a challenge for all public interaction with respect to city issues, is really we hear from a small sector of society, but not necessarily all of our residents here in the city. And it seems to be that the same individuals that don't participate their interests are not necessarily well captured in the decision making. So in the development of the discussion paper, we did reach out to people with very low incomes, working with the Social Development Center to connect us with communities where people were living either in shelters or in very low income housing, and had one-on-one interviews. So they were actually, while we had the online forum that allowed anybody and everybody that had access to the internet to provide their feedback. We had 45-minute or so conversations with 14 low-income individuals to try and really better understand the barriers. And we knew that we were not going to get that feedback through the regular online forum. So that was really helpful. And we're going to continue to do that, like looking for ways to we had to be much more deliberate in terms of getting the feedback from individuals who may actually be most affected by the decisions that are being made through the affordable housing strategy. And I'll just mention one more thing that occurred to me. There are actually new organizations forming that while maybe are not made up of members that represent low income households or folks that might be most in need of affordable housing, they are very much interested in representing the interests of the people that perhaps meet that definition. And one example I can think of is YIMBY, that is really looking or pushing cities hard to develop more inclusive housing policies that would cater or support those that are in the lower income brackets. So, so through our interactions with YIMBY and other similar types of organizations, we are getting some of that feedback as well. But it still isn't a perfect replacement for that one-on-one contact with folks that are perhaps less likely to participate. And so we're doing a little bit of both.
That's really great to hear. Thank you so much. That's all my questions, Mayor. My comments I'll save for after everyone's had their question time. Thank you.
And next up, and I think last up, is Councillor Hanmer. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Through you, one of the joys or one of the downsides of going last is a lot of your very smart colleagues have already asked the questions that that you wanted to ask. So perhaps I do have one question, and maybe Mayor, with your permission, I'll start the comment. I'll start the comments because I do have a comment too. Michelle, thank you very much for the excellent report. I think you've introduced a number of different slightly nuanced language that we may be able to use when I'm thinking of the affordable housing strategy, and it's a lot from my background. I think of everything from the supportive housing unit to what you now are describing as more attainable kinds of housing considerations, and also moving things into thinking about things as a home. So my question is really twofold. One, how do we make sure, or how do you envision that as we establish this framework and we move forward, that we are going to be successful in the implementation of it? As you responded to an earlier question, you mentioned that we've got the tools in place to enable things to happen, but they're not really happening. So how can we make sure we don't repeat that again? And then the second part of the question really is just about the framework itself and the opportunities to educate and talk to people and communicate, not just residents, but also others that we are working with, on how we're viewing the whole concept of homes and homes for those that are in the city.
Through you, Mayor. I'm sorry, I'm just actually typing this so I don't forget question number 2. So the first one is, I believe, how do we make sure that what our actions are actually, we're able to follow through on our actions, or that we're achieving what we hope to achieve? And that is always, of course, the big challenge in terms of developing strategies. You have high hopes and you have these lofty goals, and then you implement, and particularly when it comes to development where we're not actually in charge of doing the developing, it can be very challenging to see the impact as quickly as you would like to see it, given that we are reliant on many other participants in society, developers, nonprofit organizations, etc., to actually do the work that we've enabled them to do. I think the best thing that we could do is to set some targets that we feel are, even if they're aspirational, set some targets that are founded based on need and based on what we truly think would serve the community well, and then to spend a decent amount of time and resources monitoring and following up to see if we're actually meeting those targets. The benefit of doing that is, one, it makes sure that the plan doesn't just sit on the shelf and become a nice coffee table book, but not actually effective. But it also then allows us to capture problems that are, for example, the nodes and corridors problem that I've mentioned earlier, where we're just not seeing the type of development that we'd expect or we'd like to see. If we can capture those challenges earlier, we are in a better position to tweak the framework to make sure that we're actually seeing the results we want to see. And in addition to that, having more open and more frequent conversations about housing with our affordable housing providers as well as our regular market housing providers will help us understand what the barriers are that they are facing that are preventing them from carrying forward the plan that we've set out. So I think those two pieces are pretty critical, and I'm hoping that we can make sure that they end up in the final strategy, that the monitoring and the constant communication with our partners out in society who are actually doing the second half of the provision of housing. And probably, well, one could argue the most important half, which is the building of it. So I think that would be my response to the first question.
Great. Just before you respond to my second question, I think you've nailed it with that as well. The opportunity to be able to get that feedback quickly, and I think then the challenge then becomes how can course corrections happen if they need to, and that course correction could be a policy piece or something else. But we've at least got to start with opening the communication and making sure that we're monitoring the expectations and moving on them in a fairly timely way if there is an issue or a challenge. So I certainly would encourage and would look forward to seeing that kind of aspect, that feedback, evaluation, input along the way, however you will more eloquently say it than I am, in the final report. And I'll let you answer my second question.
All right, thanks. And through you, Mayor, the question is, how do we talk to people and communicate on how we view housing as a human right, as opposed to only an investment or an asset to be protected and increased in value, I guess. I think that's what the question was. And I think my answer or my suggestion would be, well, I think we can do this in a couple ways. One is through our upcoming engagement with folks who now have the ability to read the discussion paper and provide feedback and comment. We can continue to communicate that concept of housing as a human right, pulling out those principles that were proposed to form the foundation of any affordable housing strategy, pulling those out and putting them right up front. For example, in the Engage page is one way of doing it. Leading conversation with that concept maybe at the outset to set the tone for discussions with individuals is also maybe a good way to help make sure that people who are providing feedback to the city are aware that this is, one of the views that the affordable housing strategy may be taking is that this lens of housing as a human right means that we need to look at housing in a slightly different way than perhaps we have in the past. So those are two ideas I have. I'm not sure if they're sufficient, and I'm certainly open to other suggestions if you have some.
I think thank you, Michelle. I think those are great suggestions to get going. And I think it's one thing to be opening the communication and talking about it externally. It's also us and the collective us within the city to be using the language all the time that we are wanting to have people understand. So I think your suggestions will help move it a little bit as well. So thank you. That's it for me, Mayor. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Councillor Hanmer. And with that, I don't see any further questions. Just let me pause for a second, make sure there's no further questions coming out. And since we've already crossed the 1 hour mark on this topic, I'll go back for comments, and maybe we can keep them to under a minute, and then we'll get to voting. First up, I think I have Councillor Henry. Let's go with Councillor Henry, and I'll just scroll back up.
Yep. Thanks, Mayor. Great discussion. Great report. I'll just add briefly from a comment perspective. I appreciate staff's focus on those areas within our responsibility and areas of influence tangential to our responsibility. I think that's really helpful. Staff's analysis, I think, of what's been going on in the broader housing market, I think was useful too, to pull in some of that research. I think a comment I heard a while back that stuck with me is, well, supply is, solving supply is not the solution to all of the problems in the housing sector, but as long as supply is a problem, it pours gasoline on all of the other fires we have in all the other parts of the housing sector. So I think we do have a role to play there, and I appreciate the way that staff have put that in context. The one specific comment I have arising from the conversation on my questions around the fees and charges angle, I think there might be an opportunity for us to advance that a little bit further in advance before we get to a medium term sort of financing solution. Staff drew my attention to the fact that there are dollars, about $250,000, sitting in a Northdale affordable housing account we've never actually activated because of various reasons. And now that we're looking at citywide reasons, there might be some capital funding that's already being provided in the budget that could deal with the fees and charges piece so that council had a source to be able to go to in the near term before we were able to budget more long term. But I know that staff are going to meet with finance and work through some things before this come back. So that was just the one thing that I wanted to pull out as a ward councillor. I'd be willing to and happy to release those sort of dollars, not that they're mine to release, they're council's, but to release across the city to solve this this issue and contribute by making it a bit easier for folks that aren't used to building housing to build more housing that our community desperately needs. Thanks very much to Michelle and the team.
Excellent, thank you. Next up I have in the list, Councillor Bodley, indicated comments.
No, I rolled them in. I circumvented your policy and rolled them in, so I'm good. Thank you.
Awesome. Councillor Bonnegar, please go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Mayor Jaworski. This report made me cry. Michelle, it's got to be a first. From the data around the precariousness of housing in the city to the comments from the residents living this day in and day out, it's heartbreaking, but this is only part of the story. You've only brought us like the municipal aspect. So I just want to say, as you kind of take this all forward, I want to highlight the things that I love from the uptown perspective. The idea of more missing middle in more places, that's great. We can't just have neighborhood intensification in the core. We need to open as many neighborhoods as we can for gentle intensification, because I can tell you it works. Small apartment buildings fit really well into the uptown neighborhoods. So let's try and see more of that across the city. Using city-owned lands for affordable housing, especially in the core, like this is just such a big thing. It's such a big piece. I think these are some of our most valuable community assets, and I think retaining them and reimagining them to meet community needs is the best possible use for them. And I strongly like the idea of exploring a vacant housing tax or a vacant property tax, as you outlined before. The potential efforts to address the loss of rental housing and the idea of requiring rental units that are lost to development to be replaced with those at similar rent. I think these are the kinds of tools that will be just invaluable in the core. And if I can just steal Councillor Bodley's minute, like the report made me cry, but it also got me really excited about what can happen. Just one thing. It's like, imagine if we took one of our prime uptown lots. Like, imagine if we kind of took, I don't know, Caroline Street, the parking lots there across from the LRT, right near a supermarket, walking distance to almost everything a person would need. Partner with whoever we need to partner with, the region, other governments, university researchers, organizations who are already nonprofits in this space. Imagine if we all pulled together to create like an affordable and attainable and market housing development that can exist there in perpetuity because it's on our land and we own it. There's a lot that's possible. And I know that this won't solve the housing problems, but there are so many pieces of the puzzle that we can start acting on quickly. And that's what I love about this whole report and the way that this strategy is shaping up. You know, we could put a stake in the ground and we can say, these are the issues we care about. These are the people we care about. And, you know, I look at the report, I look at the community, and I know, you know, Waterloo can do this. And I'm just so glad that we're putting things in action now. So thank you, Mayor. That is all my comments.
Awesome. And in the meantime, we already have some hands up to move this one. So moved by Councillor Henry, seconded by Councillor Bodley. And assuming nothing further from Council, I will call the vote beginning with Ward 1, please.
Councillor Hanmer in favor.
Councillor Bodley in favor.
Councillor Veith in favor.
Councillor Freeman in favor.
Councillor Vassic in favor.
Councillor Henry in favor.
Councillor Bonagor in favor.
And I'm in favor too. That carries unanimously. Thank you very much, Michelle, and certainly many others who've been working on this. It's been a great report. So thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you.
Next up, I think we're going to push through this. I was considering a recess, but I think we can push through and get done in a reasonable amount of time. Next up, we have item C, the award of tender RFT 2121, Brighton Street reconstruction. A report prepared for us by Mike Lupsa. Does anybody have any questions? I already have a mover and seconder. Hearing none. Moved by Councillor Henry, seconded by Councillor Bonagor. Let's let's vote now, beginning with Ward 1.
Councillor Hanmer in favor.
Councillor Bodley in favor.
Councillor Veith in favor.
Councillor Freeman in favor.
Councillor Vassic in favor.
Councillor Henry in favor.
Councillor Bonagor in favor.
And the mayor's in favor too. That carries unanimously. Moving on to item D, the Culture Plan Implementation Report Card 2021, prepared by Andrea Hallam. I'll just look to see if there's any questions. I do already have somebody with a hand up with the mover and commentary. Let's go with you, Councillor Vassic. Please go ahead.
Thanks, through you, Mayor Jaworski. Well, first of all, I can't actually remember if Andrea, if you've, I think you had something in the council packet last time, but I don't know if we officially welcomed you to the city. So welcome. And if we have already done that, welcome again. And I just want to thank you for the report card. I love seeing it every year. This one is just as exciting as years previous, except it really highlights how the arts and culture team has changed and adapted and used what resources they have to really build arts and culture throughout the community in a way that more people can access it. Just a little personal anecdote. My kids and I were walking along the spur line, and we'd gone to the 4-Rail Trail early on for trail mix, specifically early in the pandemic when it was still just a novelty to get outside and go walking. And when we were on the spur line a few weeks ago, my kid recognized the branding of the trail mix and knew exactly what it was. And that's the kind of placemaking and community building that the municipality can do for younger generations to really get them excited about living in a place and make them feel like the place is their own. So I just want to commend you on all the work that you've done and all the work that's going to be coming up this year with Lumen and the Creative City Network Conference. And thank you for all of your hard work and what you're bringing in arts and culture to the city.
Thank you very much, Councillor Vassic. Councillor Bonagor, please say a few words. Come on.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. I'm just going to basically reiterate a lot of what Councillor Vassic just said. I just wanted also to thank the arts and culture team for all of the crazy mishmash of effort you've made over the last couple of years to keep things coming along, and also to thank the arts and cultural organizations across the city for your tenacity, because you've made it through some really hard times, and I hope that there's good things ahead for everyone. Just one note I did want to say, and it harkens back to what Chris Albinson was saying at the very start of our meeting tonight. You know, we can bring great people to Waterloo, we can make great jobs, but without good housing and without arts and culture, it's hard to have them stay. So I just want to let the arts and culture team know that we really strongly support your work, and we see it as essential to what makes us a city. And I hope that our arts and culture organizations know that we see you that way. It's not an add-on, it's an essential part of life here, and what you're doing is really important. So thank you, everyone.
I think we learned during the pandemic how much we miss arts and culture and live music and all the events that we used to be able to do. And I'm really looking forward to, in my retirement, reading the 2022 Culture Plan Report Card and hearing more about the success of Lumen this September. I'll put that out there. Very excited about that. With that, I had movers, I think. Moved by Councillor Vasek, seconded by Councillor Henry. Let's do the voting beginning with Ward 1, please.
Councillor Hanmer in favor.
Councillor Bodley in favor.
Councillor Veith in favor.
Councillor Freeman in favor.
Councillor Vasek in favor.
Councillor Henry in favor.
Councillor Bonagor in favor.
And I'm in favor too. That carries unanimously. Thank you very much, Andrea, and the whole arts and culture team for making the report card what it is here today. Moving forward, let's look to questions. Does anybody have, any councilor have any questions of staff they wish to pose publicly? Hearing none, I will look to item 17, new business. Does any council member have new business? Councillor Vasek has new business. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you. Through you, Mayor Jaworski. I wanted to let everybody know that there's an inaugural art walk in Moses Springer at May 1st. I think the timing is from 12 to 4. So just a heads up, and to keep your eye out for more details about that.
Now that's a like a community art walk, or what is it? Sounds good.
Yeah, I don't actually, sorry, I'm gonna decline that phone call, thank you. Yeah, it's organized by some people in Ward 5 in the Lincoln Heights area, and they're hosting it in Moses Springer for artists who are from the neighborhood, and I think beyond. And more than that, I don't actually have the details. They're going to be getting information flyers printed out soon with more information, but all I know is to tell you to save the date. It'll be at Moses Springer, so not like a door-to-door walk from my understanding, which makes sense. Yeah, and from 12 to 4, May 1st.
Very exciting. Always good to see the community artists and highlighting them. Wonderful. Last call for new business. Seeing none, we move on to enact some bylaws. Anybody keen on any of the bylaws? There being one only. And we are all pretty well versed in it because it's the proceedings of Council April 4th, 2022. Moved by, looks like everybody. Scrolling upwards, I have Councillor Hanmer, Councillor Bonagor. Let's do the voting beginning with Ward 1, please.
Councillor Hanmer in favor.
Councillor Bodley in favor.
Councillor Veith in favor.
Councillor Freeman in favor.
Councillor Vasek in favor.
Councillor Henry in favor.
Councillor Bonagor in favor.
And the mayor's in favor too. That carries unanimously. On the motion to adjourn, I have some old hands up from the previous one, and I'll pick moved by Councillor Henry, seconded by Councillor Freeman to adjourn this meeting. Let's begin the voting with Councillor Henry, please.
Councillor Hanmer in favor.
Councillor Bodley in favor.
Councillor Veith in favor.
Councillor Freeman, are you there?
I think she threw off the headset already. Let's keep voting.
Councillor Bassick in favor.
Councillor
Sorry, can
Henry
you
in
hear
favor.
me now? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, okay. We'll count you as an in favor on that, Councillor Freeman.
Yes,
Over to
I'm
you, Councillor Bonnegar.
definitely in
Councillor-
favor.
Councillor Bonnegar in favor.
And the mayor's in favor too. That carries unanimously. Thank you very much, team, for this. A lot of stuff covered today. Done before 5, so that's still a good day. And thank you very much for the clerk's team for getting us through this again today. All the best.
Night, everyone.